December 18, 1944, North Atlantic Ocean, 230 miles southwest of Reykjavik. Snow cut sideways across Blackwater as German shells arced out of the darkness and screamed toward the steel flank of USS Iowa, BB-61. Inside her armored heart, sailors clung to pipes and bulkheads, boots sliding on frozen deck plates as the ship shuddered under full speed. Every man aboard knew the math. One clean penetration at the waterline. One magazine hit. 3 minutes to live. The shell struck. It should have punched through 15 inches of hardened armor and exploded deep inside the ship's vitals. Instead, it vanished on impact. No blast inside. No shriek of tearing steel. Only a thunderous that rolled through the hull and died as mysteriously as it came. On the bridge, officers stared at damage reports that made no sense. Below decks, sailors ran their hands across scorched metal that should have been ripped open. The steel was scarred, blackened, but unbroken. No one aboard Iowa understood what had just saved them, and none of them were supposed to. If you're drawn to these hidden engineering secrets of World War II, now is the perfect moment to subscribe to WW2 Frontline Legends and comment where you're watching from around the world. Because the story behind that vanished shell was buried deeper than any sunken wreck. 2 years earlier, thousands of miles from that frozen sea, the fate of Iowa's armor had already been sealed. Winter 1942 had tightened its grip on the American East Coast. Along an unmarked stretch of industrial shoreline, beneath the roar of furnaces and the steady thunder of rolling mills, a sealed laboratory slept beneath a naval foundry. It did not appear on maps. It did not exist in personnel rosters. Its entrance was hidden behind a maintenance bay that officially serviced nothing more than conveyor belts and scrap hoists. Inside that buried chamber, Dr. Elias Mercer worked alone under humming lights and armed guard. Until 3 months earlier, Mercer had been a respected university metallurgist known for his work on impact-resistant steels for bridges and railways. Then, one night, a Navy sedan arrived at his home without warning. Orders were issued. Papers were signed. By morning, his life had been erased and reassigned. Officially, he was now employed in steel quality verification. Unofficially, he had been placed inside one of the most secretive weapons programs of the war. Mercer did not discover the alloy through genius. He discovered it through failure. The Navy had tasked his lab with testing experimental face-hardened armor intended for next-generation battleships. Dozens of alloys had already failed. Some cracked under simulated shell impacts. Others shattered outright under high-velocity strikes. Each failure stacked pressure onto Mercer's shoulders. He logged 14 consecutive failed batches in a single month. On the 15th attempt, exhausted and behind schedule, Mercer introduced a trace element from a rejected industrial shipment. The material had been previously classified as unstable under high heat. It was not approved for combat use. It did not belong in naval armor, but it was available under extreme pressure and furnace temperatures exceeding anything used in standard naval production. The alloy behaved in a way Mercer had never seen. As the molten steel cooled inside its casting mold, stress fractures that normally spidered across test samples simply never formed. The microstructure aligned into a lattice, so dense it defied established models. Still, theory meant nothing without impact testing. The first scaled armor-piercing round struck the sample at a velocity that had destroyed every predecessor. The projectile struck square. For a fraction of a second, it appeared to penetrate. Then, impossibly, the shell shattered. Its core fragmented and vaporized against the plate's surface. The steel did not crack. It did not dent beyond a shallow scar. Mercer assumed the test equipment had malfunctioned. He ran it again. A higher velocity, a steeper angle, a reinforced shell. Again, the projectile failed. Some rounds punched halfway into the plate and froze in place as if time had stopped inside the metal. Others disintegrated on contact. Under magnification, the alloy showed no internal propagation of shock. The impact energy was not resisted. It was absorbed and dispersed outward through the plate in widening molecular ripples. The steel behaved less like armor and more like a shock sponge built from atoms. If this discovery held under scale, it would contradict decades of naval metallurgy doctrine. And it did. Mercer reported his findings to a preliminary evaluation board with cautious disbelief. The officers listened in silence. The first response came not with praise, but suspicion. Faulty equipment, they said. Statistical anomaly. One more fluke test in a year of disappointments. Mercer repeated the tests under full board supervision. Again and again, enemy shells failed. At angles that should have guaranteed penetration. At velocities designed to mimic Germany's heaviest naval artillery. Each impact ended the same way. The projectile died. The steel lived. The alloy was lighter than standard Class A armor, yet resisted penetration beyond any known formula. Mercer warned that its composition violated existing naval metallurgy standards. The board responded not with debate, but with silence. The following morning, the laboratory was reclassified. 2 days later, Mercer's access codes were revoked and replaced with new ones. Equipment was upgraded overnight. Armed guards doubled. The research was relocated deeper underground. Its designation vanished beneath a new tier of classification that Mercer himself was not permitted to see. Within weeks, steel plates from his suppressed batch began moving quietly into shipyards without markings. They were never listed on shipping manifests as armor. They were logged as structural reinforcement, support materials, internal ballast. Publicly, the first of the new Iowa-class battleships slid into the water as triumphs of conventional naval engineering. Their armor ratings matched existing doctrine. Their specifications confirmed to every naval attaché and foreign intelligence service exactly what the Navy wanted the world to believe. Privately, unmarked steel born from Mercer's lab was already being riveted deep inside their citadels. Mercer realized then that his discovery no longer belonged to him. That moment marked the first turn in a chain of decisions that would follow Iowa-class ships into every ocean of the war. And it was the moment the Navy stopped protecting Dr. Elias Mercer. If uncovering stories about forgotten engineers and hidden wartime technology matters to you, this is the kind of history WW2 Frontline Legends exists to tell. Subscribe now and tell us where you're watching from as this story deepens. 3 months later, the Navy ordered a test no one outside classification would ever hear about. 6 miles off the Chesapeake coast, a redundant Iowa-class test section floated under tow behind a fleet of auxiliary craft. Inside the steel chamber, engineering observers prepared instrumentation. Cameras rolled. Pressure sensors armed. At the firing range, a full-scale armor-piercing shell was loaded into the barrel of a heavy naval gun. The shell weighed over a ton. Its impact velocity was calibrated to exceed the penetration threshold of every known naval armor plate in existence. Observers expected breach. They expected detonation. Some expected to watch the first catastrophic failure of Mercer's alloy. The shell fired at precisely 0930 hours. It struck the test section broadside. For one frozen instant, the projectile appeared to sink halfway into the steel. Then it vanished. There was no internal explosion, no spray of molten fragments, only a shallow impact crater surrounded by heat scars and scorched paint, as though the shell's energy had been swallowed whole by the plate. Within 90 seconds, all film cameras were seized. Within 5 minutes, the entire test range was placed under lockdown. That night, Dr. Elias Mercer was removed from the program. His personnel file was rewritten before dawn. His discovery was redesignated under a new classification tier. The Navy's official armor specifications remained unchanged, and production quietly shifted in silence. When the Iowa sailed into history 2 years later under hostile fire, no one aboard would ever be told what truly lay behind her steel. And Mercer would never be credited for the armor that refused to die. Before the North Atlantic battle that should have ended Iowa in fire and water, before sailors ran their hands across scorched but unbroken steel, before enemy analysts scratched their heads at impossible survivability reports, everything turned on a choice made in a sealed room beneath a foundry. A choice between doctrine and discovery, between truth and survival. And, at that moment, the Navy chose survival at any cost. What the sailors did not know, as they stood their frozen watches in December of 1944, was that every impact Iowa would survive had already been tested once and buried twice. And what Dr. Elias Mercer did not know that winter of 1942 was that his discovery would outlive his name, but not his life. The steel would travel across oceans. His reputation would not. And the shell that vanished in the Chesapeake would not be the last to die, without explanation. In the days after that shell vanished against Iowa's side in December 1944, the ship's log reflected only routine battle damage. Paint burned, minor deformation, no structural compromise. To most of the crew, it was just another brush with death in a war full of them. But for a handful of officers who saw the raw impact data, something about that hit lodged in the back of their minds and refused to move. They had watched the flash. They had felt the shudder. They knew what a penetrating hit sounded like. This had not been one. It was as if the ship had flexed, swallowed, and exhaled. None of them knew they were hearing the echo of a test that had already been buried off the Chesapeake 2 years earlier. On the mainland, long before Iowa felt her first hostile shell, Dr. Elias Mercer walked out of the foundry lab for the last time under armed escort. He carried nothing with him. The notebooks he had filled with formulas, micrographs, and hastily scratched observations had been stacked, boxed, and removed before he woke up that morning. His badge no longer opened his own office door. His name vanished from internal telephone lists within 48 hours. Officially, he had been reassigned to a harmless materials inspection role inland. Unofficially, he had become a ghost attached to a discovery too valuable to share and too strange to explain. In his new position, Mercer reviewed mundane steel batches destined for warehouses, depots, and bridges. The work was simple, the security minimal. No armed guards, no sealed doors, no midnight test ranges. Only the quiet humiliation of a man who had once watched projectiles die against his steel, reduced to stamping approval forms on standardized sheets. He never spoke to his new colleagues about the alloy. He never mentioned the live fire test that ended with a missing shell. He never described the night his entire life had been redacted in a single meeting. He understood something most people never have to face. The Navy had decided his discovery belonged to the country, not to him. At sea, the implications of that decision began to show in ways the world would never see on newsreels. When Iowa joined convoy escort duty in the North Atlantic, her presence alone discouraged surface raiders. Long-range aircraft and U-boats were the real threats. Yet the planners who drew her patrol lines thought in terms of conventional armor. Angles of impact, shell calibers, torpedo warheads, the same math admirals had used since Jutland. What they did not factor in was what lay beneath her paint. One night, a storm rolled over the convoy like an iron curtain. Visibility dropped to nothing. Radar contacts flickered. Somewhere in the dark, a German torpedo bomber slipped through gaps in the screen and loosed its payloads toward the mass of ships below. 2 torpedoes ran shallow. 1 ran deep. The shallow weapons struck their intended targets in the merchant line. Steel ripped. Men died. Flames climbed into the night. The deep-running torpedo tracked toward Iowa. It hit at a glancing angle below the main armor belt, an impact geometry that made post-war analysts argue for decades over what should have happened next. The warhead detonated. Water heaved upward. The hull rang with a metallic roar that sent men sprawling. Internal lights flickered. For a moment, the ship seemed to sag. But she did not break. Later inspections showed deformation and flooding, but not the catastrophic breach some expected. Compartments that should have been open to the sea remained sealed. Bulkheads that should have buckled held, bent but unbroken. Men who studied the damage argued that clever compartmentalization and sheer luck had saved the ship. Luck had played its part. So had steel that did not behave according to the textbooks. For viewers following the trail of these impossible survivals, this is the kind of hidden thread WW2 Frontline Legends was created to pull. If you haven't yet, Subscribing now and dropping a comment with where you're watching from lets this story reach even more people who never heard it in school. As Iowa continued her wartime career, the pattern repeated. In exercises, test charges detonated closer than planned and left only scorch marks where test officers expected serious repair work. In combat, shells that struck obliquely at just the wrong angle somehow failed to tear open vital compartments. Debriefings blamed inferior enemy fuses, poor shell quality, manufacturing flaws under Allied bombing. Some of that was true. Not all of it was. Across the ocean, German analysts pored over battle reports. They compared confirmed hit locations with the damage described. Photographs of Iowa-class battleships returning to port after action showed scrape marks, dents, and patches of new paint over areas where, according to their own ballistic charts, there should have been jagged, lethal holes. Someone, one report suggested, had either exaggerated the accuracy of German guns or underestimated American steel. Those analysts did not know that in a locked American archive, full-scale test results on one specific class of alloy had already been sealed away with classification stamps and missing pages. They did not know that the war's most advanced battleship armor never appeared in official metallurgical textbooks and would not be openly discussed in any classroom. Inside the ships themselves, the men who lived close to the armor developed quiet superstitions. One machinist mate, standing off watch near the inner bulkhead of a citadel after an action, ran his knuckles over a faint heat discoloration nobody had noticed until then. That patch of steel marked where a shell impact had rung through the entire hull just hours earlier. It was barely warm now, solid, unbroken. He joked that the ship was learning to swallow shells whole. Another man refused to lean his back against that section, as if the armor remembered the violence it had absorbed. In the middle of that long war, none of them had time to wonder why their jokes and superstitions were closer to the truth than the manuals they had been issued. At the same time, far from the ocean, Elias Mercer's own life narrowed to a series of small, repetitive motions. He measured carbon content in mundane samples, checked hardness, signed off on tolerances that had nothing to do with armor or high-velocity impacts. His days passed under fluorescent lights that did not flicker with the heat of test blasts. Occasionally, envelopes arrived from former colleagues still inside classified programs. They contained nothing more than heavily censored letters, harmless greetings buried under black lines and missing phrases. He would hold them up to the light, knowing that somewhere behind those redactions lay ship names, displacement figures, impact velocities, and temperature curves. He would never see them. He heard rumors. He heard that the Navy's new battleships were performing beyond expectations under fire. He heard that enemy shells were failing at ranges and angles that made no sense. He heard sailors in distant bars talk about hits that felt wrong, impacts that sounded like a hammer on a bell instead of a knife through canvas. He never asked questions. The choice he had made when he first reported his impossible results, the choice to tell the truth and let the Navy decide what to do with it, had run its course. The Navy had chosen to hide the truth and deploy the results. In a war for survival, that choice made a harsh kind of sense. The men on Iowa did not feel like test subjects when they slept a little easier under decks that shrugged off punishment. They were fighting for their lives, not writing textbooks. But history is written in the spaces between what people know and what they are allowed to know. During a later bombardment in the Pacific, Iowa's guns opened up on shore batteries that flickered from jungle-covered hillsides. Enemy guns replied, their shells clawing for the battleship's vital organs through spray and smoke. One heavy shell landed close to the waterline, almost stern-on, an angle known to be dangerous in older ships. Damage control teams braced for bad news. The report came back strange. Local denting, coating stripped, heat scoring, no rupture, no flooding, no explosive spall lancing through compartments to cut men in half, as had happened on less protected ships in earlier wars. To the men holding those reports, it was a relief, nothing more. To a mind trained like Mercer's, had he seen the exact impact diagrams, it would have been confirmation that the impossible alloy was not only in service, but performing exactly as those forbidden test plates had predicted. As impacts piled up across campaigns, a quiet pattern emerged in internal memoranda. One series of damage assessments, now long buried in archives, noted non-standard energy dispersion characteristics in certain internal structures. Another mentioned unexpected resilience to localized overpressure. Engineers attached to repair yards circled those phrases, added question marks, and then moved on to the next urgent job. War leaves little time for theoretical curiosity. But at the moments when Iowa should have come home with deeper wounds, she did not. And under every coat of primer, beneath the visible scars of war that photographers captured for newspapers and newsreels, the true skin that had absorbed those blows remained anonymous. For viewers watching this unfold decades later, every one of those near misses and impossible survivals carries the fingerprints of a man no sailor ever saluted. If this kind of hidden connection between one forgotten scientist and thousands of lives interests you, subscribing to WW2 Frontline Legends and telling us where you are in the world helps bring more of these buried stories back into the light. As the war dragged on, Mercer's name slid further from the center of the Navy's attention until it tipped over the edge and disappeared into the paperwork of peacetime. He was not court-martialed. He was not imprisoned. He was simply forgotten in exactly the way highly classified contributions often are cordoned off, compartmentalized, and absorbed into the machinery of an institution that moves on. What did not move on were the records. In basements beneath naval offices, metal filing cabinets held documentation on the alloy, its composition, its heat treatment profiles, its live-fire results. Film canisters sat on shelves, their labels indicating impact angles, shell types, plate thicknesses. Somewhere among those reels, a sequence of frames showed a full-scale armor-piercing shell disappearing halfway into a plate before leaving nothing but heat scars. Those reels never appeared in training films. The papers never entered standard technical libraries. For a long time, they simply sat in the dark, aging slowly alongside the men whose names appeared on their covers. At sea, the steel they described continued to do its work without complaint. The war ended. Flags changed. New enemies replaced old ones. Ships were modernized, repurposed, or retired. The Iowa-class battleships, Legends and Steel, survived into an era of missiles and jets, their massive guns both symbols of past power and potential tools for future conflicts. But even as their systems were upgraded, even as electronics and radars and missiles came and went, the deepest layers of their armor remained what they had always been. The thing no public document would fully explain. The thing the Navy itself might have been afraid to confront in detail. Not because it was weak, because it was too strong, too strange, and too far ahead of the doctrine it was supposed to fit inside. By the late 1960s, the war that had birthed the impossible steel had faded into grainy documentaries and aging photographs. Men who had fought aboard battleships now worked civilian jobs, raised families, and told their stories only when asked. Programs once locked behind steel doors loosened under the slow pressure of time. Cold War secrecy replaced World War secrecy. New threats demanded new classifications. Old ones were supposed to be archived. That was when the gaps began to appear. Naval historians searching for full metallurgical records of Iowa-class armor between 1942 and 1945 encountered a silence that did not match the rest of the documentary trail. There were production totals. There were shipping logs. There were even partial heat treatment tables. But entire testing series were missing. Live-fire impact data stopped abruptly at the edge of Mercer's timeline and resumed years later with no bridge between them. File titles existed without contents. Film reels were logged without any playable record. One suppressed technical memorandum, buried in a declassified packet released 2 decades later, contained only a single surviving line. Anomalous absorption behavior not suitable for public doctrine. No author. No attachment. No explanation. By the time researchers began to realize what they were looking at, Dr. Elias Mercer had been dead for nearly a decade. He passed in 1971, quietly, in a small inland town far from any coast. His death certificate listed no connection to the Naval Research Laboratory, no wartime commendations, no classified service. To his neighbors, he had been a retired materials inspector who rarely spoke about his past and kept to himself. He owned no property of interest, no safe, no locked cabinets. When his modest home was cleared after his death, his personal papers contained only ordinary correspondence, tax records, and a handful of technical textbooks available in any university library. The notebooks were not there. The formulas were not there. The diagrams that had once traced shockwave pathways through living steel were not there. His family was questioned quietly. They denied ever seeing such materials. They denied knowing where the notebooks might be. Some suggested he had destroyed them himself. Others wondered whether they had been taken long before his death, removed so thoroughly that not even Mercer remained certain when they disappeared. Without those notebooks, the only remaining physical proof of his work remained in the bellies of ships. When the Cold War reached its uneasy twilight and modernization programs stripped Iowa-class battleships down to their bones, engineers encountered the same mystery their wartime predecessors had quietly noted and moved past. Beneath layers of visible armor and reinforcement lay plates that did not match standard specifications. Steel that resisted cutting in ways technicians did not expect. Material that flexed before it fractured. Alloy that behaved according to rules no current manual described. Some upgrades replaced those mysterious sections. Others were built around them. Few asked why. In the absence of official documentation, rumor filled the vacuum. Some whispered the alloy had been refined through techniques lost with its creator. Others suggested it had been the accidental byproduct of impurity rather than design, something that could not be reliably reproduced without Mercer's hand guiding the process. A darker theory spread in engineering circles, that the Navy had ultimately judged the material too unpredictable for widespread use, too strange to be trusted in the age of guided missiles and computerized targeting. Steel that absorbed energy in ways nobody fully understood was a gift in the age of guns. It was a potential liability in the age of nuclear warheads. When the last Iowa-class battleships were finally decommissioned, cut open, scraped, and reduced to numbers on a ledger, the public saw only the massive gun turrets, the towering superstructure, the legend of steel that had spanned 2 centuries of warfare. What the public never saw was what lay deep behind those legends, where even salvage crews encountered sections of material that refused to behave as expected under cutting torches. In some yards, entire plates were removed intact and quietly transported to government facilities rather than recycled with the rest of the hull. No explanation was given. No record of their final destination has ever been released. Historians argue today whether the Navy ever truly understood what it had in Mercer's alloy. Some believe the tests proved enough for wartime survival, but not enough for peacetime science. Others believe the full implications of the steel were deliberately never explored, locked behind classification, so deep that even successor programs inherited the silence without inheriting the knowledge. The truth is harder to pin down than any shell trajectory. What remains undeniable is the pattern. Shells that should have penetrated did not. Impacts that should have killed hundreds resulted in scorched paint and shaken nerves. Damage diagrams that should have shown jagged internal destruction instead showed shallow craters and bent steel with no rupture. Somewhere between the first failed test batch beneath that foundry in 1942 and Mercer's unremarkable death in 1971, the Navy made a choice that still echoes through every unanswered question in those missing files. They chose outcomes over explanations. They chose survivability over doctrine. They chose silence over credit. Mercer never saw his name attached to the ships his work protected. He never stood on a deck as sailors cheered a ship home that should have been lost. He never watched a shell fail against steel he had once held glowing hot with tongs. Whatever pride he may have felt, whatever conflict haunted him in the years after his removal, it was locked inside a man who understood that his discovery had become something larger than his life. In the end, he did not get to decide how history would remember him. History, for the most part, did not remember him at all. Yet the evidence of his work survives in the negative space between disaster and survival, in the wrecks that did not happen, in the casualty lists that should have been longer, in the ships that returned when probability said they should not. The vanished shell off the Chesapeake was not a fluke. It was a warning of a future no doctrine had yet written. And when Iowa stood unbroken in the North Atlantic that December night in 1944, every sailor on board owed his life to a man whose name he would never know, and to an alloy that official history insisted did not exist. Even today, the final fate of that steel remains unanswered. Was it refined and folded into later secret programs? Was it abandoned as an anomaly too difficult to control? Does it still sit in classified vaults, waiting to be rediscovered by another exhausted scientist on the 15th failed batch of a desperate experiment? Those questions remain open. What is known is this. The world was shown one version of Iowa's armor. The Navy used another. And the difference between the two was measured not in inches of steel, but in lives that did not end on the cold floors of shattered compartments. If stories like this remind you that not all heroes wore uniforms, subscribe to WW2 Frontline Legends and tell me where you're watching from. I read every comment.